Hi, folks. I'm Adrian, the Director of Intelligence at Accord Analytics. I specialize in AI, so developing AI systems to detect and discover fraud, and analytics, which is kind of more like algorithms, so like complex mathematics that discovers fraud. I'll share my screen so you can see what I currently see. Great. Yeah, yeah, today's little half an hour session is when accountability systems enable fraud. Um, yeah, which look, this is like the key problem of governance is actually figuring out when fraud is embedded in your systems, which otherwise you think are on the money. Yeah, it's a little bit about me. Yeah, I was an anti-corruption investigator for a number of years, and then I worked as the senior economist for Main Roads in WA, helping figure out complex economic models to figure out where we should build roads, which actually leads nicely into AI because that some of those very big data models we'd use actually use the same algorithms as AI. So there's a nice little segue back into intelligence and anti-corruption. So four little things about me. About what we've done at Accord Analytics is we've developed a number of high ROI apps. So yeah, some of them find about $200 of fraud for every $1 of cost, which I'm super impressed by. And yeah, we've done a whole range of things. So we've discovered unexpected criminality for clients. It's led to referrals to the Crime and Corruption Commission in Western Australia. And in the last, I think, 2.5 years, we've found about $10 million in fraud. So as I'll take you through this, and you'll see how fraud can be caught up in governance systems. When you understand how it works and how it gets embedded in there, you'll see that when you can start to unpick it a bit, you'll start to find all the things that you couldn't find. So I reckon there's only three things we're going to go through today. The first one is fraud is a human event, so it's not robots, it's not computers, it's people. So understanding people is like a key bit of it. Maybe, and the next one's maybe a bit surprising, is that your governance, whether they be the policies, processes, systems, all of that, actually shapes the fraud that's going to be in your organization because fraud is fundamentally reactive. And thirdly, enabling fraud, or when it gets embedded, is your business processes. Improving your business processes, unfortunately, seems to increase fraud, weak internal controls, and high trust in internal controls. So essentially, we're going to look at those three things in the next 20 minutes. So the first one is that people commit fraud. Yeah, it's human. It has all the complexities of humanity actually embedded in this kind of conduct because it's conduct. It isn't accidental. So I really thought there's a couple of like minor examples where it could be accidental, like you put in the wrong date or something. But I mean, broadly, the fraud that we see is intentional and it's often connected to personal circumstances. So we had in the media recently, there was a case of a payroll manager who stole about $900,000 and he was motivated by gambling debts. So, and unfortunately for Australia, we have the highest rates of gambling debt losses of any country in the world. Yeah, so personal circumstances, again, are a huge little vector in this. And then maybe surprisingly, or not surprisingly, the role that the person has and the level of discretion they have significantly impact the type of fraud. So, for example, if you're a small business owner who had a small market store where you like sell fruit and vegetables, and money went missing from the till, well, actually, it's likely to be or connected to be the person who was on the till. like the roles and responsibilities that you hand out shape the type of misconduct or fraud that can happen. So if something went, if you had a gardener as part of your staff and a whole bunch of tools are missing from the garden shed, well, the first person to ask is the gardener. So yeah, there's a really great report by Professor Robert Clickard called Corrupt Cities, which is free on the internet. And here's a lovely economic model that unpacks how you configure your organizations and what roles you get is actually defining the types of fraud and misconduct throughout your organization. Yes, I think if you understand that actually fundamentally an organization shapes the kind of fraud that it's going to have, when that happens, then you can really start to unpack a lot of it. And lastly, it's fluid and adaptable and responsive to the organization. So yeah, when I was a kid, I had a beagle and he was lovely and fantastic. But one of the things that he did was always break out of our fences. And I suppose he had a lot of time to figure out how to conquer the next fence that we put up. So when he was a little puppy, he got through the wire fence and we put up a bigger fence and he jumped over that and put up a bigger fence. I think fraud is a little bit like that, where it will respond and adapt to the environment, to your governance that you create. Yeah, okay, so let's start at the very beginning, how governance shapes fraud. So, so here's one of our clients come to us very early on in the piece and said they wanted me to try and figure out who was committing fraud in their overtime system. So we're going to look at just overtime as being a way of understanding this. And the first thing they talked me through was the huge list of transactions, which are overtime transactions. And he said, look, all of them have an approver and all of the reasons they've given seem legitimate. So why should we think that there's any fraud happening? And that is, I think, most people's assessment. They see an audit team or someone sees a whole bunch of transactions. They go, well, that's the employee. Yep, that looks up to date. Yeah, 3 hours. Yep, the manager's approved it. And then finally, the reason they've given looks legitimate. So we can expect that there's no fraud in the system. I think what it misunderstands is what fraud looks like. So I think in this version of what fraud looks like, that person would expect to see a fraud claim, an overtime claim like this, where the person's entered their employee ID, they've entered the date where they had the overtime, the hours they've had the overtime, then the reason that said, oh, I didn't work it, I just want the extra dollars, please. See, that actually wouldn't be successful because the manager, and in this case, there's no manager approval next to it, the manager isn't going to approve it because it looks like fraud. So successful fraud that happens in your business doesn't look like fraud, because if it didn't, it wouldn't be successful. I think that is like the key bit to get, is any one of these could be fraudulent, but you aren't going to know from just looking at it, because all these have to look like a real thing to be successful. So how does it happen? In the first instance anyway. So I think fraud is best understood as a minor adaptation to a plausible event. So let's say here's an overtime claim, which was approved by a manager. And let's look at the parts. So there's an employee ID, great, that's the person who's being paid the money. There's a date where it happened, the hours that were worked, the manager that approved it, and a reason. Well, you only really need to adjust one of these, a minor adaptation, and suddenly you've got a fraud event. So firstly, so let's say urgent report for the CFO approved by a manager. Well, that actually might have happened on the 20th of May. And what this person's done is just duplicated it, put a new date in place and submitted it. So, and the manager, probably quite busy, look at it and go, oh yeah, that's right, they did have that urgent report for the CFO approve. So it would get into this little database because it would look exactly like a real claim. It looks very plausible. The next one they could do is they could just extend the hours, or maybe it was only 1 hour that they worked of overtime and they put in 3. So they got 2 hours of extra pay in there. Yeah, so that's another little adaptation just to extend everything a little bit. They fabricated a reason. They may have literally not worked or done anything, or even been in the office, and they've put that request in, and it looks legitimate to the approver, and they've approved it. And lastly, because in this scenario, the manager has to approve it, the manager may also be in on it. So in many examples, actually the worst kinds of overtime fraud is where it's a staff member and a manager working together to generate fake overtime claims. The person gets paid and they split the cash at the end. So you can see how we've defined our overtime claim form is how the person's going to set up to create a fraud. So yeah, so other than this one, because that's where it's getting paid, all they have to do is adjust one little part of this in both keeping its plausibility, but also then suddenly it gains a whole bunch of fraud. So if it's a duplicate, like the day after, well, that's 3 hours of completely fraudulent claims. And that will look exactly like that. It will look like all of the others in your huge database or data set of overtime claims. So fundamentally, however you shape, and things that's like fraud isn't static, it's fluid. So if you ask different questions or had a different process, like my beagle back in the day, who just sits there and eventually finds a way through, whatever process you have, it's going to, that mechanism, that form by which you govern it is actually the same thing that's going to be frauded. So I suppose fundamentally, you need to understand that actually there is no perfect solution because everything. So, for example, before this form, let's say they didn't have a manager approval. I thought, great, we've got a manager approval in there. That will stop the fraud. Well, actually, now suddenly that becomes a vector of the fraud itself, where the manager now can work with the staff member to commit fraud. So, however you set up your system, proactively, the fraud event is going to happen reactively to the system that you've created and truly be completely invisible to someone who's looking at it, because it doesn't look like this. It doesn't look like, I didn't work it, I just want extra dollars, please. It looks just one little fudge on here somewhere, and it retains its plausibility and becomes suddenly very effective. Now, the crazy bit about this is that once it's been successful once, and let's say it's been paid, the person's got their money, the person realizes, oh, that worked. So the reason for it working is connected to the reason for it becoming embedded, and that's the real question is, how does it become embedded? And we'll get to that now. So how fraud gets embedded? It becomes embedded because the organization expects it. So like a business as usual kind of activity. Yeah, so for example, my business can't be, you couldn't get a fraudulent overtime claim through my business because we don't pay overtime. We have a different pay structure and that kind of stuff. Yeah, so there's 0% chance that we could be defrauded by overtime, literally because we have no expectation that we're ever going to pay it. So if we saw a claim, we'd be like, how? Why? It doesn't actually make sense in terms of how our business works. So that is the, again, fraud is reactive. So whatever you do is going to define the fraud. So if you do pay overtime, we can expect overtime to be defrauded. If you pay a lot of money to vendors, you could expect, oh, our vendors are going to exploit us to some degree. If you let people use the company car, again, this is another thing that you expect to do. But if you didn't do it, then suddenly you've cut off that vector or that particular kind of fraud just by not expecting or not doing that thing. So whatever you do is going to be defrauded like reactively. And this is kind of the next one's the sad one for most people. Frictionless systems make fraud fast and efficient. So if your manager, for example, isn't on the ball just approving things, the limiting variable to the amount of fraud that is undertaken is how they're willing to press that payroll button and submit and get it approved. Because actually the whole process is suddenly almost fully automated. From once it gets into the payroll system, then it's straight essentially the next pay into their bank account. Whereas an old system, which I'm not saying you should go back to, but the old system was, let's say you had to send the form to Dave, who passed on to Jeff, who gave it to Margaret, who finally gave it to someone else, and they processed it. The person would have to tell 4 lies. Lie to the first person, to the second person, the third person, the fourth person, and hope that in that chain somewhere there wasn't somebody who thought, well, why did this happen? I'll query it. Whereas a non-manual, frictionless, highly automated system suddenly strips out all of that friction. So whereas before the person would have had to steal $100,000, would have to go and just do 50 manual forms, and then all those people would have to like process it, and at some point something's going to notice. Whereas in an automated system, then it's just how often am I willing to click that button. The third one is weak controls allow fraud to continue. So depending on having a dependency which is flawed. So in this case, the manager approval is quite a flawed process because they trust all their staff. If so, and they may have some sense of who's working and who's working hard and all that kind of stuff. But actually, if you're a high trust employee from your manager, then actually that manager control is very, very weak. So a weak control. And the one which really embeds it is that the organization puts a high amount of trust in their current processes and systems. So the first one is they think, well, the payroll system's infallible. It's the amount of checks and processing that all adds up, that adds something, and everything only gets in there because the managers approved it. So actually the biggest thing that stops fraud, or that lets fraud be embedded, is that everyone trusts that this thing is working properly. So here's a nice little table. So yes, overtime spend. If you don't expect to spend overtime, you're going to be not vulnerable to it. If you have clunky manual processes which have put a huge amount of friction in place, you're going to actually limit the amount of damage that someone can do and make overtime claims. And a weak control. So if you have multiple layers of governance, like literally you has to get approved by a manager and then a director, that's a far better, that's makes you less vulnerable to it, because essentially that person has to tell more lies. So lie to their boss and then lie to the manager, or then lie. And actually that's quite a social restraint. Like a lot of people will happily tell one lie, but actually to keep on, like per incident, I suppose, but have to tell 10 lies to get one overtime claim through fraudulently is actually a huge social deterrent. And then finally, that you look at your system here with all the claims and you don't trust it. You think there could be a way that this is fraudulent, because fundamentally, if you get to as an auditor or integrity or wherever you are in your organization, and you see this and you think this way, well, how can there be fraud? Everyone's been approved. All the claims have a good reason. Therefore, fraud is unlikely. If that's your mental pathway, then that is the biggest way that it becomes embedded. Whereas if you challenge that, you think, well, actually, fraud won't look like this. It won't look like I didn't work, give me extra dollars. It will look like a minor adaptation to a plausible event. So when other plausible events, they all look plausible. If you have that skepticism of your system, then actually that is the best way to unpick it. Yeah, I hope that taking you through how it happens in the first place, and then those other big cultural bits and other organizational bits for how it gets stuck and you just can't get rid of it. How do I stop sharing this? Okay. I should have said there's a Q&A here, so if you have any questions, fire away. What else? If you don't have any questions, then share my screen again. Oh yeah, here's my details. So you can email me at adrian@accordanalytics.com, and my mobile is 0405 040242. Yeah. What else? I think every week I'm going to have a half an hour. We're going to hopefully we'll try the same time next week. And if you have any questions, or I'll just run through some aspect of fraud and how you can find it or how it gets embedded in your organization. Yeah. Every week we'll have something and you can chuck me your curly questions about fraud. But yeah, it is like fundamentally it's reactive and it's fluid, and actually the organization's own mental architecture about how they think about fraud is the biggest thing. If there's anything that could change in an organization, it's not to make your payroll system like old again, you bring out the one from 1984. It's not to stop doing the things you're doing. Yeah, so it's not to stop doing the things you're doing. It's not to go back to clunky old systems. It is to improve your governance, but then again, the problem with that is actually that your manager itself can be in on the fraud, and that's quite a big problem, because if, let's say in this case, the manager was in on it, the audit team and integrity team say, hey Jeff, how come you've improved Susan's you've improved $150,000 of overtime in the last 6 months, and he says, oh, she's the best worker we've got. I'd rather pay her another 150K than get someone else who doesn't know how to do the job. And audit team or whoever's asking, oh, well, fair enough, and then ticks it off and away you go. So even a better control can still be subject to the management system itself being compromised. But this is the one to change. Yeah, it's just have a bit less trust in the systems that you use, because it won't. Fraud doesn't look like this. It looks like, yeah, it doesn't look like, yeah, ineffective fraud. Successful fraud is successful because it looks like a minor adaptation. Right. Great. Well, thanks everyone. I think that's my 20 minutes up. So if you have any questions, yeah, send them through to my email, or give me a bell, and yeah, or message me on LinkedIn. Perfect. Okay. Thank you.